historic day in Washington as the House finally gets the votes to repeal Obamacare. We'll look at what's in the bill, how local lawmakers voted, and all the complex politics involved. Then FBI Director James Comey back on the Hill today. This time, it's in front of a House committee grilling him about Russia and Hillary Clinton. Was Comey able to explain why he announced the Hillary Clinton probe, but not the one into candidate Trump's ties to Russia? Also, President Trump comes home to New York for the first time as president, but he's not getting the welcome he was hoping for. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, the Republican-led House of Representatives today finally succeeded in voting to repeal and replace Obamacare. The bill, which continued to be tweaked as arms were being twisted right up until the final vote, got just enough votes to pass. 217 in total, one more than the bare minimum needed. Politically, in the short term, it is a win for President Trump and the House Speaker Paul Ryan. Both stood the most to lose if the GOP could not follow through on its long-standing multi-year campaign promise. But the real test for this bill may be in what it does and does not do, and also how the voters will react. There is a lot to cover on this tonight as we try and separate misinformation from fact. We'll get to the vote, the cost, the impact, including some changes that will probably impact, if not shock you. For more on all of that, we turn to senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman, who drew the short straw and had to try and make sense out of a bill that, frankly, most lawmakers haven't read, and we don't even know how much it costs.
Yeah, but that certainly didn't stop the smiles and chest bumping from the White House as President Trump and congressional leaders celebrated this after this afternoon's vote. It is a victory, though it may be a short-lived one, as the bill now heads to the Senate and, even more importantly, heads to the American people. A major win for President Trump.
And thanks to the leadership of President Donald Trump, welcome to the beginning of the end of Obamacare.
This is a repeal and a replace of Obamacare. Make no mistake about it.
House Republicans fulfilling their pledge to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act.
Are we going to be men and women of our word? Yes. Are we going to keep the promises that we made? Yes.
But is it a win for the American people? According to last week's ABC News Washington Post poll, just 37% of Americans say Obamacare should be repealed and replaced. 61% say it should be kept and fixed instead. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi saying Republicans are only making health care worse.
Does Trump care lower health costs? No. Does Trump care provide better health care?
No. But the bill still faces an uphill battle in the Senate.
You're walking the plank for what? A bill that will not be accepted by the United States Senate.
Now, each vote was absolutely essential given how thin the margin was for this bill to get through the House and given the political impact that this vote is likely to have. So we wanted to run down how every member in our region voted on this bill. For Long Island and New York City, Lee Zeldin and Peter King voted yes. King actually said he didn't like the bill, but he wanted to vote yes to move it to the Senate, where he hopes senators will change the bill. Staten Island's Dan Donovan voted no, as did all 12 Democrats representing both the city and Long Island. In the Hudson Valley, Republican John Faso voted yes. The Valley's other three members, all Democrats, voted no. And the vote split the GOP delegation from New Jersey. Leonard Lance, Chris Smith, and Frank Lobiondo from South Jersey voted no. Rodney Frelinghuysen and Tom MacArthur, who authored many of the changes in this newest version, voted yes. And again, all 7 Democrats from the Garden State voted no. So that's how they voted, but what exactly did this House vote for this afternoon? Well, let's start with the top line, the cost and how many people will lose insurance. And the truth is, we don't really know the answer to either question, and neither do the members of Congress who voted for it today. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, never had a chance to score the bill, so we don't know its cost or how it'll impact the deficit or how many people will lose insurance. Those estimates, there are estimates that have that number in the range of between 14 and 20 million Americans may lose their coverage. Okay, so what does this bill do? Well, there's way too much to cover it all, so here are the major highlights. The bill does repeal and replace Obamacare. It also does a lot more, like changing the way Medicaid works and how many people it will help. Overall, Medicaid would cover far fewer people. As many as 14 million Americans would likely be impacted and kicked off Medicaid. The AHCA changes the way the federal government funds states that oversee Medicaid from a set lump payment instead of payments based on how many people are actually enrolled. The upshot, States will have to either limit Medicaid payments or cover fewer people in their Medicaid programs. And one more note on Medicaid. It turns out states rely on Medicaid funding to help finance special education programs and staffing. And 70% of all school districts rely on Medicaid funding for special ed. That means if the AHCA becomes law in this form, school districts would have to either find new funding or cut special ed staffing or student levels. The other major change in this version of the AHCA is on coverage of pre-existing conditions. The change designed to cut that coverage, thereby saving the government money while representing the appearance of additional protections. The literal text of the bill does guarantee coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. In other words, you can get coverage. What it doesn't guarantee is how much you'll have to spend to get covered if you have a pre-existing condition. Obamacare did. And if your state decides to remove those cost protections, it could also apply to employer-based insurance. In other words, if your state doesn't guarantee pre-existing protections, your employer can also remove those protections from your policy. In that case, you and anyone else deemed to have a pre-existing condition will have to turn to a high-risk pool for coverage. About those high-risk pools, I've described them as the Alcatraz of health insurance. That's where all the troublemakers or bad apples in the market go. In health insurance, those troublemakers are anyone who can't get covered anywhere else, often because of the pre-existing conditions. People in those pools will face higher premiums, higher deductibles, and fewer options. The only help for the pools are from cash subsidies from the government to help offset some of the costs. Those subsidies were the focus of the last-minute change that helped put this bill over the top in today's vote. The House came up with $8 billion over 5 years to help subsidize high-risk pools. But the Kaiser Family Foundation, a nonprofit that is the bipartisan best source for healthcare policy information, says the need of subsidies is much larger, like $200 billion over 10 years. That's $20 billion a year. The House version allocated $1.6 billion per year. Bottom line, what will be the impact on people with pre-existing conditions? Well, they will get covered, but they'll have to pay a lot more for the policy, to use the policy, and they could see massive bills should they seek treatment for their pre-existing conditions. Here's an estimate of how much more expensive your premiums are likely to get if you have one of these pre-existing conditions. Got metastatic cancer? You'll get insurance if you have an extra $142,000 to spend on your premium every year. Other cancers could add more than $72,000 to your insurance premiums. If you're pregnant or ever have been pregnant, $17,000 a year. Got a kid with autism, asthma, or diabetes? Add $4,000 to $5,000 to the cost of your premiums every year. Now, there's a political irony in all that. States that voted for Trump tend to have more people with pre-existing conditions than other places. These are the top 5 states. All have more than 30% of their population with pre-existing conditions: West Virginia, Mississippi, Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee. And they all voted for Trump, and they all did so bigly. All right, at this point you might be thinking, okay, not great for people with pre-existing conditions, but I don't have one. Well, you might. Turns out the list of what insurance companies consider to be a pre-existing condition is pretty extensive, and the GOP just added a few new pre-existing conditions to their bills, and those additions may shock you. Remember, under the AHCA, pre-existing conditions will at the very least make your health insurance premiums more expensive and may make it too expensive for you to afford. Among the new pre-existing conditions, sexual assault. Get raped and your insurance premiums are going to go up. Domestic violence is a pre-existing condition. So is having a cesarean section or suffering from postpartum depression. And this is just a sample of the other ailments considered pre-existing conditions. It's a list that includes gravely serious things like cancer, heart attacks, and strokes. But it also includes more common things like acid reflux, high blood pressure or cholesterol, heartburn, being overweight, and insomnia. And in what seems like adding insult to injury, suicide attempts are also considered pre-existing conditions. It's estimated, as you see at the bottom of your screen, between 19 and 50% of all Americans are afflicted by something that could be considered a pre-existing condition. One final note about the AHCA that would get a whole lot more attention if it weren't for all these other points. The bill passed this afternoon by the House. It also completely defunds Planned Parenthood. Rich?
Oh, by the way, what we hoped when we figured out this morning was we would give you a 5-6 minute primer on what is in this thing, so at least you have an idea of what I believe will be the next 2 weeks of narratives as congressmen come home for the break. Andrew, let's do this in pieces. Sure. The big thing is, this thing has changed so many times. It's fair to say Forget about not being scored by the CBO. And what that means is the CBO is a nonpartisan group. They don't have a dog in the fight. They take a look at it and they say how much it's going to cost us, whether it be in deficits. They'll figure out how many people will be on the outside looking in. They do the real math. This thing has not been scored, and that was intentional. They wanted this thing to be voted on before they knew what it would cost. But the second thing, for people who remember, Nancy Pelosi took a lot of heat, deservedly, when she said you have to pass the bill before we can basically read the bill. Republicans for years said that's not a way to run government. Tonight, I defy people to say, I don't believe the president has read this bill, and I don't believe the majority of Congress ever read this bill. I believe what you just broke down, the majority of the members of the House of Representatives did not know what is no longer in and what has been added to it. Would you take that bet?
I think I would. I think the people who are involved in the negotiation probably have some sense of it, but a
Rank
lot
and file, though,
of the
haven't.
terming, like pre-existing condition, unless you get into the nitty-gritty as we did with that list and explain exactly what a pre-existing condition is, a lot of people don't think of it as that particularly serious. You even had a member of Congress this week, as we're looking at President Trump's plane, Air Force One, touching down in New York as he makes his first visit back as president tonight. But you know, we even had a Republican lawmaker this week who said, pretty much if you've got a pre-existing condition, it's your fault. The other part, in addition to the hypocrisy of voting without reading the whole thing, is you had quotes from people like Peter King. Peter King is a pretty well, held in high regard as being a member of Congress. Even he said, look, I don't like this bill. I just want to get it out of here and get it off my plate, and we'll let the Senate do the heavy lifting of doing the fixing.
And we'll get to politics in a second, but I think the other part that people pay attention to, sure, what reactions and receptions are the local lawmakers going to get when they get home? Especially when you will see tomorrow, starting to be in your local dailies and some of the reporting online, what Andrew just laid out. People consciously put into the bill new things that would be considered pre-existing conditions. And Andrew mentioned one of them. Who in their right mind thinks if someone tried to commit suicide or if someone was raped, you want to penalize them, that would be a pre-existing condition? That's exactly what this did with a litany of all the other things. And the idea for all the people who have developmentally disabled kids, that all of a sudden you're going to go in your pocket for another $6,000 a year, and that's nothing compared to $140,000 additional a year, there's going to be sticker shock. But the people, Andrew, who are going to get the sticker shock, they're more Trump voters than they were ever Hillary voters. I think people are going to be stunned what's in this thing.
Yeah, we show that list of the states, the 5 states with the highest percentage of people with pre-existing conditions are all states that Trump won handily. And those states have a tendency to be on the top half of that list. This has always been one of those issues that in the abstract, oh, Obamacare, bad, you're going to force me to buy insurance, that's bad. But when people start figuring out the specifics of it, and that it might impact them. I mean, a lot of people...
And just to amplify your point, all those states there, they're all red states. That wasn't a coincidence to the color we used to show you the bar. Those are the people most severely impacted by this.
The pre-existing conditions, you talked about sexual assault, and you talked about some of the... It's not just... You're getting treatment for your immediate injuries, but then there's counseling that's required, there are follow-up visits, all of which is going to come out of your pocket, and oh, by the way, it's going to jack up the premiums for your health insurance.
Anybody at home who thinks, oh, well, you know what, I feel bad for those folks, it's not me. This changes what your employer doesn't have to cover depending on the state you live. Finally, I know we're over, but really quickly, I believe, as much as we're talking about pre-existing conditions, and they will be a big story, Medicaid will become the dominant story. I don't think people realize, and you touched on it, just how much Medicaid on state levels, the poorer states who need this stuff, with that really significant cut that's in there, what will now go by the wayside. Special ed mentioned one of them, but there's so many other things that Medicaid covers the breach for. That goes away under this bill.
It does, and the total number of people who are going to be on Medicaid is going to go way down. First of all, just the money that's going from Washington to the states, there won't be enough to keep the same number of people on the rolls. And states are not going to be able to make their budgets match up with the limited amount of money that they're getting from Washington. So they're going to have to restrict even further who's on Medicaid and who gets that assistance and who doesn't.
And just as one final thing, there were a lot of folks who changed their vote because $8 billion was added to this. To give you an idea, $8 billion is less than 4% of what is needed. So if they had problems that there was going to be a shortfall for the pre-existing conditions, that $8 billion is an hors d'oeuvre of what's going to be required and what's there now compared to what will be. All right, coming up next, As we said, obviously, today it did pass the House. But what will happen when it gets to the Senate? We'll look at the next stage here for this Republican health care bill as we talk politics with our panel straight ahead.